And we are live.
Good morning, everyone. It's the one and only V, the Grill Economist, and we are back again for the Sirius report with none other than the premier intelligentsia himself, London Paul. Paul is going to be breaking down, everything that's been happening and everything that's been going on with the French elections, the Eurozone, Russia, the Middle East, the gold and silver markets. I mean, there is a litany of things that we got to cover today. So without further ado, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Well, good morning. Yeah, I'm very well. And yourself?
I'm hanging in there, man. I'm shocked that France is in the predicament that it's in. I sense voter fraud. I don't think there's no way that Macroni was able to get 65% of the vote. It just sounds preposterous. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the official results a bit, but it's roughly 65-35. Weirdly,
Hmm.
just after the first presidential round of elections, that's roughly the ballpark figure they thought he'd win by. I mean, it's quite incredible. They knew the result 2 weeks before they even had the vote. But I think what's interesting is in 2007, there was 16% abstentions, and in 2012, there was about 19.5% abstention. In this election was 25.5% abstained.
Yeah.
And there was a number with spoiled ballot papers, some left them blank. But in reality, Macron only got 43.5% of the vote when you factor in, obviously, these abstentions. And what's also interesting is apparently supporters of Mélenchon, I think, however you pronounce it,
Yeah.
obviously he didn't make the second round of the presidential elections. Now, they apparently predominantly refused to vote for Macron. Now, given that Mélenchon posted around 19.5% of the votes in the first round, what happened to that proportion of votes? Did they all decide to abstain? Or what happened? Because that's a significant proportion of votes. Now, where did they go? If they didn't go to Macron, seemingly they didn't go to Le Pen. What all these voters decided to abstain? I mean, I very much doubt it. So that's a little bit of a strange angle that I guess we'll never know the answer to. And then I was saying to CJ before we came on, I'd seen something. I don't know whether it's valid or not, but there was people opening envelopes, and there was supposed to be ballot papers in them, and you should have one for Macron and one for Le Pen, and there was two for Macron.
Yeah.
So that would, certainly there might be some suggestion of
That's a
voter fraud.
playbook right from Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they never do things differently. That's the point. I mean, their MO's the same wherever it is. But I mean, in terms of Macron, of course, there's this whole build-up where, just before the election, he says he was the target of this massive coordinated hacking attack, and there was all these campaign documents and internal emails and financial data that were posted anonymously, which of course Macron's team said were false. But it was just before midnight on Friday. Now, there was a lot of debate as to why wasn't this discussed at the weekend. Well, there's this legal election pause when Macron and Le Pen are banned from making any statement till the polls closed, obviously 8 p.m. French time yesterday.
Right.
And I'm not sure exactly about this, but France's Electoral Commission stated that publication or republication of these documents or information could be a criminal offence, and were warning news agencies not to do it. And they urged citizens not to rely on these leaked documents in order, what they said would affect the sincerity of the vote. This is the French Electoral Commission. I mean, we've just talked about strange goings on in the vote, and the Electoral Commission's worried about the sincerity of it. Now,
Unreal.
and of course, on Marshes is obviously Macron's political party in it. Well, I'm not sure how many people are in it. I think it's just him, but it says he was the victim of this repeated hacking, and of course, it was groups backed by the Kremlin. So of course, Russia was to blame as usual. When aren't they to blame for anything? Um, Now, what's interesting in the sort of backdrop is that Macron threatened to launch legal action against all what he called fake news and lies. Now, interestingly, the RT broadcaster editor in chief has said that the media would go to court over accusations made against the outlets. I think there was Sputnik as well, that by the headquarters of obviously Macron about this spreading of fake news. And
Yeah.
that was in relation to these alleged offshore bank accounts. So there may be some mileage in this. And you do kind of wonder, well, what exactly is going to happen with regards to these allegations? They all just going to die a death and kind of be buried, and we'll never, heard anything said about it again. But that's a separate matter. But you look at Macron, and he's not that age is an issue, but he's obviously the youngest ever president. But his rise to power is strange. I mean, 3 years ago, he was named as Hollande's economic minister, something
Right.
voters seem to have forgotten. Because, I mean, let's face it, Hollande's economic policies worked wonders for Holland. I mean, France.
France, yeah.
So
Very successful. I mean, nothing's more effective of us than stimulating the economy than by saying that you want a 75% income tax. Wonderful.
exactly. So he launches his own party. This on March 12 months ago. But the reality is his politics going to be any different from Hollande? It might all sound so, and there's all this, I'm taking this centre ground, so I'm trying to appeal to everyone.
Right.
But the reality is France, like everywhere else in Europe, has got a huge economic and social crisis. The country's very divided and despondent, and there's all this excuse that that's why millions of voters turn to what they deem political extremes, such as Le Pen. But the one thing, and I said to CJ just before we came on, it's people will be despondent and go, well, why didn't Le Pen win? From my perspective, it's better Le Pen didn't win, and these are the reasons why. Rather like Macron, he may be the president, but the problem is he was never really elected, by virtue of having a mandate to govern. He's never held an elected post. Okay, he's promising all these changes and this bright new future for France. Well, this is great, and expectations are high. But where's the delivery? Because he's got no formal political party. I mean, his party's never fielded a single candidate in any election, whether that's local or national. So he's going to have to move at breakneck speed between now and the June legislative elections if he's going to get a majority of seats in the National Assembly. I mean, I think so far they've got 14 candidates registered and there's 577 seats up for grabs. Now, that's going to be difficult for him to achieve, and the danger is that France will become even more politically paralyzed, making, a two-round general election, because it is possible to have a two-round general election, as much like you can have in the presidential election if there isn't an overall majority, and that's going to end up being more important from my perspective than the presidential elections. I mean, okay, the presidential vote was to give the new leader a parliamentary majority, something he's going to find very difficult to do, because that's normally how it works. So the guy's got no MPs. He's going to have to organise this parliamentary majority from scratch in roughly 6 weeks. Now, I mean, the basic bottom line is if he doesn't have a parliamentary majority, you can't govern. It's as simple as that. He might be the president, but if he's in a minority, the other parties will just run roughshod over everything he wants to implement. So, I mean, it's kind of strange because France's constitution is this president's this kind of supreme political leader, and he can choose a prime minister and government ministers. But if he obtains this majority, okay, he can enact all the policies, and we know exactly what he's going to do. It will be Hollande Mark II. There's no doubt about it. I think that's absolutely true, and we know that. And it's just going to be one disaster after another, and France will just descend into chaos. But I think the reality is France, rather like the rest of Europe, will descend into chaos anyway. And in that sense, if I was Le Pen, I'd be sat there going, well, it's a good job I didn't get elected, because whether it's 6 months, a year, or even less, and everything starts to implode, people aren't going to remember that Le Pen lost the election. They're just going to remember, well, Macron was the president and France imploded and he's to blame. So
yeah.
Now, of course, if the issue you also have is that, he could have the biggest group of MPs as well, but not even a majority. So then he's got, that's a possibility. So that could leave his government with a bit of room for manoeuvre, but they're not entirely stymied, but pretty much are. And so that's another problem. And also he could face a hostile majority in the lower house of their parliament, and he's forced to adopt a prime minister outside his party. So then he faces this period of what's called cohabitation, which means he can do little in the face of this constant opposition that we've said. So it all looks great for Macron in principle, and everyone's going to be very disappointed that, that Le Pen's lost, because they think, Macron is a complete shoo-in for the establishment, whatever else you want to call it. So that is a huge problem. But, the only thing that might work in his favour is there's disarray in all the socialist parties and the conservative right, following these first round defeat. But even some preliminary analysis suggests that Macron is lucky if he may just get a majority of seats, but he might even not manage that. So he's going to have huge problems because he may be the president, but I think he's going to have a big job trying to command a majority that will agree to his policies. And the other thing, of course, is even if they can be sat there going, because we know his policy is going to be hugely unpopular with the French people. I mean, it's Hollande Mark II. They were so fed up of Hollande. I mean, look what happened in the first round of the elections. Their candidate got 6% of the vote. I mean, it's not exactly a ringing endorsement for Hollande. So if he does just turn into Hollande Mark II, which seems very likely, then his policy is going to be deeply unpopular, and very quickly the French people will turn on it. And we all know when the French people get very angry, they'll just have massive strikes, which they've done in history. They won't just sit back and tolerate it, because they may have been duped, and quite rightly, I think they have. That Macron's this wonderful centre guy who's a bit like Trump, because he's never really been in politics, and he wants to do well for the people, but you scratch below the surface and realise that's not true. So I wouldn't be, if I was Macron, I'd be sat there going, hang on, what exactly have I been duped into doing myself? Because it's clearly he was kind of shoehorned in, because the fear was, well, the traditional parties aren't going to elect it, and it will just create a landslide for Le Pen, and that's why he was encouraged to do this, to counteract that. But he doesn't realise that being the president doesn't mean anything when if you don't have a parliamentary majority. You've got the country alienated against you, and in the meantime, all the macroeconomic factors in the European Union are going against you. Geopolitically, everything's going against you. So I don't think he's going to be that pleased to actually be the leader himself, but I think it's one of those, it was a job he had to take, and he was kind of railroaded into doing it. But he hasn't got any experience. I mean, as much as we say, well, Trump doesn't have the experience, and he didn't politically, I mean, he had a number of some other experience.
Right.
I mean,
He has
not necessarily the age, is he? Yeah, exactly. And I'm not saying Macron's done nothing with his life. I mean, okay, he's 39 years of age.
But here's the thing, Paul. Macron follows the same type of career path that you would find in somebody like a Janet Yellen. This is somebody this is somebody who's he's worked in banks, he worked in finance, this, that, and the other, but he's a crony capitalist. This guy is slightly left of Mao in terms of his political leanings, right?
Well, and this is the big problem, and there's no doubt that the Kabbalists, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, are probably thinking, it's business as usual, everything's going fine, we've got everything back on track, the European Union's fine, it's never going to crumble, it's not going to disappear. And I made the comment on Twitter the other day, this is a vote between delaying the death and end of the European Union and finishing it off rather quickly if Le Pen had been voted in. And that's absolutely the case. The cabal are not going to win because Macron's been elected. The European Union's dead and buried, whoever gets elected. But it's great. It's interesting that you see all these comments coming out, and they think, somehow this is a victory, and it's business as usual in the European Union, because you had the same thing in Holland with Wilders didn't get elected, and they thought, there's a situation where once again these populist parties haven't been elected, and therefore it's the end of populism as we know it. Well, the truth is that Le Pen, arguably will probably have to reform the party or leave. I mean, there's always talk that she may leave a party, form another one, and fight it on a different ground. And there is an argument that says she may have to do that, and because I think her party was dogged with ideas of being extreme, and that in whether it's right, wrong, or anything else doesn't matter from the electorate's point of view. If they believe that, it puts them off voting. But I certainly think Le Pen's got every chance of winning the next election. And people say, well, that's 5 years off. Well, it might not be. Elections may happen a lot sooner. It just depends what actually happens in the geopolitical and economic sort of shitstorm that's going to happen whenever it's going to happen, whether it's 6 months, a year, whether it's less, who knows? But we all know it's coming. So the situation is, if she may have to slightly reinvent herself, but she's very likely in the next election to win, and whenever that is. But in the meantime, that doesn't stop the fact that everything that's coming is coming down the track, and the cabal might think they can stop it. And I think genuinely, some of them do. I mean, there's people in the European Union who are now kind of openly stating that, as far as they're concerned, the US has lost all mandate in the Middle East, and it's time that people talk to the EU about how to resolve these problems. They feel like somehow they sidestepped the US and somehow are now the numero uno in the world politics, and everyone should pay attention to the European Union. So there is this delusional factor that's still coming out of Brussels and the European Central Bank and the European Commission, etc. But it's just delusional, and so I wouldn't be too despondent. I've seen a lot of comments where people are saying Macron winning is a really, it's globalist one, and it's not, because the reality is there's a long way to go in this whole process, and I wouldn't be too despondent. And truthfully, I don't think Le Pen's probably that bothered she didn't win. I mean, when you stack up the reality of what's coming down the track, I don't think she's that bothered, and I don't think she really felt she had a chance. I mean, whether Macron got 65% and she got 35% of the actual vote is, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was 55-45, I don't know, but I don't think she'd be too despondent, because equally she would have had the same problem Macron had, not to the same extent. Was, how does she form a government? Would she have got the requisite number of seats? Well, arguably not. I think she might have had the same problem as Macron, or maybe more of a severe problem. So there's no guarantees. Even if Le Pen had been elected, she might have been the president, but we equally would have just not had any capability to govern. So I don't think we should dismiss that either. So I wouldn't be too despondent. It's like we say, in the end, it's the journey isn't really the relevant point here. It's the destination. The destination is ultimately the same for the cabal. So I'm not that despondent, and I'm not really that surprised. I didn't expect, in all truth, to wake up this morning and see price of gold gone up $100 an ounce because Le Pen had won or something. So, and that's the interesting thing. The market obviously clearly had priced all this in, because if you look at it, gold was slightly up, a couple of dollars an ounce, and basically, if you look at the forex markets, are pretty stable. There was no great movement in the Dow or the FTSE or the DAX or anything like that. So I think this was all priced in, that Macron was a shoe. And I think the point about the gold market is maybe there was some element of smashing a bit in. I don't know, I heard you say earlier on about this in terms of the election, and that's a distinct possibility. But because there was a risk factor that, well, there's a great trade to be made here, because if Le Pen gets elected, rather like we had in Brexit, I think it went up $80 an ounce within hours of that announcement. So there was a thing about, and I think that's just people trying to manipulate markets and see if they could make some swing trade on it. But truthfully, there was no real movement, and it just absolutely suggests that Macron was a shoe, and everybody knew it, and I think Le Pen knew it as well, in all honesty. And there will be a contention now as to all these allegations against Macron, and we'll see if anything comes of them. But chances are it'll be yesterday's, what I call, chip shot paper, and people will forget about it very quickly, and the focus now will be on, well, okay, Macron, you've made a lot of hot air, you've made all these statements, rather like, sounds a bit like Obama did in 2008 with all his, I'm going to change. It's change, and we're going to restructure this. And the reality is, of course, we know he isn't, but very quickly the electorate will lose patience, because France is still simmering. I mean, maybe the reality is, at this point in time, given the choice, if people would rather have not voted for Le Pen or Macron. Macron's seen in many people's eyes as the lesser of two evils at this point in time. Yeah, there is undoubtedly people who've been duped and imagine that Macron is going to do an Obama 2008 change around the US without realizing, of course, Obama never did. But then there's plenty of people in the world, especially in Europe, who think Obama's the greatest US president ever and still believe it. So
that's the delusion. It's like it's in order for you to think like that, in order for you to work with that type of mental modality, you have to absolutely abscond yourself of any sort of real fact, Paul. I don't know what it is about the mentality of many that are the far left that is in the West, and especially Western politics. They're out of control. They're out of touch with reality. It's shocking.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I know people in the UK who genuinely do think that Obama was a great American president. When you try to point out the facts to them, of course, they just glaze over and don't really want to talk about it anymore. And Well, fair enough. Well, the French people, for whatever reason they voted him, are going to be in for a very harsh lesson in reality in the coming months, because even if he manages to scramble a majority together, I don't think his policy is going to be so unpopular with the French people. But
I think
it's
personally, I think Obama is the greatest Muslim, gay, black president with a transsexual wife. But that's my opinion.
well, yeah, that really would give people a glazed look, but yeah. So I think that's really, we've kind of, I guess, exhausted the whole French election. What we can watch now is to see, well, what happens with the president, the parliamentary elections, and does he form a government, and then just see what actually happens in his presidency. But I think he's in for a very, very tough ride, and anyone who thinks it's going to be easy for him is missing the point, I think, to a large extent, what's really unfolding. Because despite what seems on the surface, France is simmering, and it's been simmering for a long time, and people are very angry about things. And it won't take much for Macron to fall on his sword very rapidly if he doesn't deliver. And people's expectations are going to be extremely high because he's given that impression. So they won't. The patience is not something you associate with the French, and I think very much they'll lose patience rapidly.
I mean, especially now that as they're basically going to be pushed off the economic precipice, and at which point there's going to be austerity coming to France, because that's the only thing the Euro kleptocrats know. And when Germany gets behind the war drums of, hey, let's have some austerity in France, because Germany is the one holding 90% of French debt. And then what are the Parisians going to do when all of a sudden their free bus rides go up, $10 or something like that, or their or their 10-week work, they're what is it? They work like 10 weeks out of the year or something like that, and their paid vacations go away, and all the other wonderful benefits of living in a socialist utopia evaporates against the hard stone of reality. What's going to happen then, Paul?
Well, yeah, exactly. It was going to be, well, not exactly a French Revolution again, but in inverted commas, yeah, the people are not going to tolerate it. I mean, and the unions are pretty powerful still in France, so they can drum up a lot of support, and they will just grind France to a halt. And they're quite capable of doing it. They will just stop everything.
Yeah.
And how long is the government going to be able to tolerate that? They'll give it 24 hours, and then the alarm bells go off when they realise it's not going to stop. So yeah, we await with interest, but I wouldn't be despondent about it. And it comes back to the point: it's rather like, it doesn't matter whether Trump's president or Trump isn't president. What's coming is still going to happen. It's the same whether whether Macron was elected or Le Pen. I mean, but from Le Pen's point of view, it's probably better, because I think anyone who's now in power at the moment, it's career suicide, because humanity is not going to forget the people who are around. And some people might be more forgiving because Macron's only appeared on the scene recently, but it's rather like Germany. I mean, who'd really want to take over as being the chancellor in Germany from Merkel, given what's coming down the track? You just wouldn't want to bother. So I think it's better to be on the sidelines, and then when the real change has to come on, or the implementation of it, then you can seek to be elected then, when you might actually be able to be a bona fide prime minister, president, or whatever else, and form a genuine government who tries to look after the interests of your people, as opposed to the pseudo puppet governments Western nations have, as we all know.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah, so I think we've kind of exhausted. And I thought I'd mention a bit about Trump's healthcare bill. It kind of interested me when I looked at some of the details, and you went, oh, well, talking about jumping out of frying pans into fires, I think speaks for what this healthcare bill is. I mean, we all know it squeaked through by, I think it was 4 votes through the US House of Representatives. But for me, I know what they've dubbed it Trumpcare. It looks an absolute unmitigated disaster, and this is the reason why. Apparently, there was an amendment which allows states to opt out of covering basic healthcare needs, as well as allowing states to opt out of covering pre-existing condition. Well, that alone is just absolutely farcical. Mm-hmm. And in place of covering citizens with these pre-existing conditions, Trumpcare is going to allow this really small fund to set up high risk pools in which apparently sick and injured people can gain coverage. But apparently these pools provide coverage with high premiums, high deductibles, and worst of all, next to no coverage. So this is another disastrous aspect to this new healthcare proposal.
Is
Now,
it?
if the same state, sorry, go on.
Do you think it's Trump care or do you think it's Ryan care that we're seeing?
Yeah, exactly. I think yeah. Well, yeah, it looks a bit like Ryan
Yeah,
Curtis.
yeah,
Um, and then if you go on, if I mean, obviously, if the same states opt out of covering essential health benefits, the coverage for pre-existing conditions will be even worse. So now there's this belief, and we'll have to wait and see what this happens. That states most likely to opt out of covering pre-existing conditions and essential health benefit are likely to be the states that people who voted for Trump. So that's going to really impact I mean, even though it doesn't matter, they are still quite nervous about the 2018 election. So,
yeah.
because obviously they could lose their mandate in Congress and the Senate, I guess. I don't truthfully understand US politics exactly, but clearly, the 2018 elections are pretty important. Now, the problem is that, as well, is that there's millions and millions of Americans who purchase policies through this Obamacare exchange, and they live in Republican congressional districts, and so
Right.
that's likely to also cause major problems. Now, and there's countless millions of other Republican voters who are covered through Medicaid, which apparently this Trumpcare is going to slash just by nearly $1 billion. But hey, let's not worry about that too much. Not of them saying Medicaid was the answer, but it seems like they're just taking a bomb to everything, blowing it all up and going, well, that's the solution. And Medicaid's going to be phased out, I understand, within the next 3 years. Obviously, if this Trump care, Ryan care, whatever it is, becomes law. And then Trump comes out with this great thing, well, this is a great plan and it's going to get better. And we are repealing and replacing Obamacare. And well, yeah, you most certainly are doing this, but what the replacement is farcical. I mean, it's like, as I say, it's like jumping out of a frying pan into a fire. I really cannot see possibly how this is going to be any benefit. And there's no doubt within the next 3 years, there's millions, probably tens of millions of Americans who are going to lose their healthcare insurance. So this is hardly a ringing endorsement.
Yeah.
And obviously, probably within maybe 2 presidential terms, if we look at it in that sense, not necessarily that Trump's going to make 2 presidential terms. Something like, I think there's estimate, of course it is only an estimate, that up to 20% of Americans will lose coverage under this new healthcare plan. So it kind of doesn't look like much of a healthcare plan to me. It's like let's many people as possible in terms of their coverage. Let's find every reason not to cover them, but that's a success. I mean, it's just absolutely farcical, and it's another classic example of just trying to appear to do the things that you said you were going to do in your pre-election campaign. But when you start to scratch, and I just didn't spend that long, I just looked at some of the detail, and I was just like, it is an unmitigated disaster, and it's absolutely farcical as a replacement healthcare. But it's not really a replacement at all. It's just taking the existing one, putting more ways of excluding people from the policy. And where's the detail? Where's this great healthcare that's going to be provided for all Americans in the replacement? Well, there's zero evidence of that. So
Well,
I
Paul,
mean, it's just
Paul, if we play 5D chess, if we're going to play 5D chess right now, Paul, would this be a way of collapsing the entire or hastening the collapse of this Obamacare in total? If we were playing 5D chess.
well, yeah, exactly. Well, that's true. But it's just it's just an example. It's like everything they're trying to introduce internally, all the kind of tax reform bills we talked about. That I mean, the deficit's just going to skyrocket. It's just farcical when you start to look at the detail. There's absolutely zero substance in it, and then just to make some of them. I mean, hate to be sort of picking on the US administration as much as we do, because the rest of the world, or the Western world's far from perfect in this regard. But I also mentioned there was the US House of Representatives who got this bill where they're enhancing sanctions, they said, against North Korea. Well, okay, fine. But apparently, one of these sections was they outlined this inspection of authorities over Chinese, Iranian, Syrian, and Russian ports. So what the United States says is that it's allowed to, by passing this bill, it can effectively just go and run roughshod over any nation. It can go and establish control over, say, Russia's Far East port, so that includes Vladivostok because it's in the vicinity of North Korea. Not that it violates the concept of international security, and Russia's just going to stand there and go, yeah, well, of course you can come and examine our port. I mean, why? I don't quite understand if it's to do with the vicinity. I can understand, well, not that I understand the bill, but Russia's got, obviously, Vladivostok, and the Chinese are in close proximity to North Korea, quite what Iran and Syria are, unless the world's flipped on its axis and somehow Iran and Syria are now in the Far East. I don't see quite how that's justifiable either. But of course, the Russians are saying, well, to be honest with you, from their perspective, this is like tantamount to a show of force, and in really in international terms, it's a declaration of war, and the Russians aren't literally saying, well, we're going to go to war with the US. But it's this farcical nature that they think they can just introduce these bills that allows them to do it. And the rest of the world's just laughing at them, going, well, this is just not enforceable and you're not going to get away with it. But who are they trying to deceive? I mean, they're trying to deceive the people of the US into believing they have some strength and authority still in the world when clearly they don't. And that's eminently the case. But it was just absolutely incredulous to see them propose a bill where they could just think they can go and walk into sovereign nations and demand to examine their ports and see, what activities are going on. Not that, of course, he's no
delusion. I mean, it just goes to show, Paul, there is no intelligence anywhere in U.S. politicians or the military-industrial complex. I said it earlier this morning. These guys are working on an obsolete, out-of-date, and archaic worldview that no longer applies to the reality today. These guys are delusional. And they're just making up things. I mean, look at Nikki Haley. It's a perfect example, Paul. The woman sits there and makes up stories about Russia, and and we laugh at her, we make fun of her, but she's no different than any other politician, and that's the problem. She is the norm. She's not the exception, Paul. That's what's scary about this country.
Well, I mean, I hate to, so as we say, not trying to pick on the US too much. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's and unfortunately, the rest of the world's going, look, seriously. You actually genuinely. I mean, they think it's a joke until they realise, in fact, it isn't a joke, and that people are actually taking this matter pretty seriously, and they genuinely mean what they say, but they just find it incredulous to believe that it's possible that a nation such as the US can be now run by people who make these absurd remarks, and it's causing absolute confusion. I mean, I was going to mention something to do with Ukraine, which kind of puzzles me because we're picking on the House of Representatives again. Now, on the one hand, they've passed this bill that says it prevents the US from arming, or the country, sorry, from arming and training Ukraine's, or these ultra nationalists. There's this Azov battalion who are real just neo-Nazis. Now, this, on the one hand, sending out this strong signal to Kiev that, it's not going to be tolerated anymore, that arming these, neo-Nazi factions. So you think, okay, well, that's quite a good end. And then you find out that there's still rogue elements in the US military who are operating a group of US personnel who are now stationed in Donbass. Now, Donbass, I think everybody knows, is where obviously the flashpoint is and where all the civil war's going on in Donetsk and Lugansk. Now, they're there to train personnel of a mechanized brigade, which is Kiev-controlled territory in Lugansk. And they're training them how to plant mines and advanced techniques to carry out sabotage in the Lugansk People's Republic, including in public areas which is clearly defined as a war crime. Now, apparently there's other mercenaries there as well, but what I don't get is that you've got the flip side where the House of Representatives who's trying to do some good in the area, and then now we know this is to do with the fractured nature of the US, intelligence services, etc. But there's no one trying to get a grip or control over this, while these complete contradictions are happening in areas that they shouldn't even be involved in at all. And then having the audacity to then complain about Russia meddling inside Ukraine, which actually the Russians aren't meddling at all and are not involved in any way, shape, or form. But, it's kind of, there are also these US operatives that are inspecting military equipment and whether these units are ready for combat missions, which implies that there's another major offensive about to happen in the Donbass region. And it's this level of incredulous behavior. And unfortunately, 7 or 8 times out of 10, when I look at these things, it involves some aspect of the US. Now, in this term, it's probably just the rogue elements are clearly probably CIA, and I think the CIA is very split down the middle now, or maybe not quite down the middle, but there are elements who want to work for the betterment of the US and its foreign policy, and there's clearly elements who do want to do exactly the opposite. Yeah. But it's another example of this incredulous behavior that we just see happening on a weekly, well, almost daily basis now.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems as if Trump is so busy, like so incredibly busy with what is happening domestically, that there's some things, the key elements. Like, I mean, how does, I sit there and I question myself, Paul, like, how do these international troop movements and deployments are occurring without the president knowing or acknowledging that these types of situations, these types of positionings, is a very, very bad thing, because all you need is one thing going wrong that can create a cascade effect of unchangeable or unturnable events that could lead us to a very, very precarious place, man. It's very disconcerting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, and I think that the reality is there's a lot of chest puffing out by the US now. I mean, essentially, they've lost all mandate in the Middle East. I think they're just persona non grata. They're largely on the flirting on the edges of what's going on, particularly in Iraq. They have very little influence in Syria, very little influence. I mean, despite all the rhetoric coming out regarding the Palestinian question. I mean, this is another example. The reality is, Trump can say what he likes. He can sit down with Abbas. They can talk about things until the Israelis and the Palestinians sit down and behave like, mature adults. The problem is never going to get resolved. But it's another way of grandstanding, is to make the US look like they're important on a world stage. But they've lost the mandate, as far as I'm concerned, in the Middle East. And there's no doubt there are still rogue elements. I mean, another example of something that came out was I think it was Assad who made the point, and even Putin a few weeks back after the first false flag chemical attack, that was a risk of it happening. And then apparently there's reports that something was filmed by Al Jazeera in Syria, and it was ordered from a European country, which is another false flag chemical attack in it. And some military or diplomatic source leaked this information. And by all accounts, the area it was supposed to be filmed in, the white helmets have suddenly rolled up into town, which every time they roll up into town, people should be very afraid, because they're not there to assist people in humanitarian ways, as we know. So there are going to be these rogue elements, and certainly, okay, in this case, it's a European country, but who was it? And ultimately, where's the mandate come from? Well, I very much doubt a European country under its own steam is going to do that. So we're going to see factions within the US administration or inside the intelligence service who are going to carry out activity or try to once again implicate Assad. But they've largely lost the mandate. And if you look also in North Korea, the US has completely backed off. They've gone very, very quiet. I mean, the rumblings have turned to nothing. And you wouldn't think a few weeks ago that we're on this point of the US deciding to take a preemptive strike. I think they now realize if they take a preemptive strike, and we said this, that would be the conditions for the Chinese to pull the plug and say, we're having the financial reset, whatever you want to call it, is going to happen. I think any major event, then the Chinese and the Russians will pull the plug and it's game over. And I think the US realized that is the case, and why they've largely backed off with regards to that. And of course, the whole Iran thing keeps simmering. And now the Saudis apparently have stated, we can't negotiate and work with the Iranians. There's no point trying. Well, a few weeks ago, they're having lots of private chats and getting along fine. But I think they're just puffing their chest out, because once again, they want to feel important, because the House of Saud's on the verge of collapse.
Right.
And then there's all these very strange deals going on with the US. But I think it's really the House of Saud's just trying to retain some relevance. So in the people's eyes, they have they have that relevance and mandate to carry on governing the kingdom, but in reality they don't. So we're seeing this huge change, and of course, geopolitically, who are the main players now? Clearly, Russia and China. Everywhere you go, if you look below the surface, they're involved in what's obviously going on in North Korea. They're involved in the Middle East. People don't realize China's far more involved than perhaps people realize in certainly economically and geopolitically. I mean, they're not so much involved militarily. Of that, there is no doubt. Although there is certainly evidence of them having some involvement in what's going on in Afghanistan, as an example. So they're not entirely not involved militarily, but largely it's more geopolitically in terms of in that regard, and also economically. As we know clearly, I mean, trying to form a lot of trade relations with Syria is one example, and Egypt's another, and the list goes on and on. And certainly, we know they've backstopped Iran a lot and want to build Iran up to be a strong nation again, as do Russia. So that none of that's a surprise, but it is, and that's why I think the US is just desperate to appear to have some validity in the world, and they no longer do. And the world largely has said, we don't see you have that relevance, and certainly the European Union's fighting desperately to retain some relevance too. And it almost seems like it's given up any hope of forming any genuine relationship with Washington now Trump's in. So they're trying to go alone. They're like two sort of dinosaurs slugging it out to stay alive. I mean, and in the process, they'll just destroy each other. They're not going to survive. The European Union's not going to survive because it thinks it will stomp all over Washington.
The European Union is the deranged geriatric patient that has walked out of the hospital still holding on to his IV drip, and he's rolling it along down the sidewalk while he's wearing a hospital robe. That is the European Union at this point, Paul.
It is. I know. But also, they're obviously in intensive care, so they've had to drag all that along with them as well. And it is. I mean, that's literally what it is. They're all on life support machines and scrabbling just to fight to have some relevance. And you can see in the desperation when you got Juncker saying that, as far as he's concerned, the English language is irrelevant in Europe now. Meanwhile, half the documents and everything's written in English. I mean, English is still an important language, and always will be in Europe. I mean, probably actually more so than it should do, and that's why British people particularly are so lazy at learning foreign languages, because everybody speaks English.
Right.
I mean, just to give you an example, in Holland, in the universities, there something like 2/3 of the courses are just taught in English.
Right.
It's all English, English textbooks, English everything. So.
Absolutely. I mean, you go to Southeast Asia, there are many countries that have English curriculums in their school. There are places in Southeast Asia where there's more English-speaking population there than there is in the United States.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, even like I mentioned previously, in North Korea, English is on the curriculum.
Yep.
But
we don't need it. That's the let's all learn Arabic.
Well,
let's all learn Saudi-styled Arabic. That's the future.
Well, in terms of Juncker, it's just debatable exactly what's going on. And I think actually the strain and the pressure is beginning to show on all these people inside the European Union. On the surface, they're trying to give the impression that everything's just swimming along, ticking along fine. But the reality is that it's beginning to dawn on them that the game's up. But they've got to carry on, because they can't just throw in the towel and say, it's all over, because obviously they're not allowed to do that, because they're puppets as much as anyone else is puppets, such as Macron. I mean, wherever you go up the food chain, they're still puppets. They're still there to do a job, and as they're told, and they're compromised to carry on though and give that deceptive view that all's well in the world. But it's like, but unfortunately, what European nations need to wake up to is they need to stop being so subservient to the European Union and realize that, in fact, they can be autonomous and make their own decisions. All they've got to do is stand up to it, because the European Union ultimately is powerless. They just have this aura of power, but it causes huge, catastrophic effects in the process. I mean, we know the big problem with the whole migration crisis in Sweden, and something that came to my attention, which is kind of interesting, is that Sweden is lifting these identity checks on people entering the country from Denmark. Now, Denmark obviously geographically is very in close proximity to Sweden. And now why I find this interesting is they introduced these border controls because in 2015 they had this huge problem with asylum seekers. It was like hundreds of thousands, I think it was nearly 200,000 tried to come into the country. But apparently the reason they've had to let this drift is because it requires an exemption from the EU's free movement rules. Now that's due to expire in 3 days on the 11th of May. So they've gone, oh, well, we're just going to have to lift the ID checks. Now, in some senses, lifting the ID checks will end delays, because thousands of people are cross-border commuters. People live in Denmark, work in Sweden, vice versa. But the government said, oh, it won't lead to a return to this huge influx of asylum seekers because the numbers dropped off in 2016. Yeah, do you know why they dropped off? Because you did precisely the measures you did. Whereas if you actually stop those, what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to go, well, that's a great way. We can get between Sweden and Denmark because you've removed ID checks. And this is where the brain power of governments just goes out the window. And Sweden's going, well, if you come into Sweden, we're going to have all this increased surveillance and we're going to X-ray vehicles and number plate checks and do all these things. Yeah, fine. But if you find another way of getting into Sweden, or you go into Denmark, you can get into Sweden because you're relaxing these border checks, and they may not be so stringent on people arriving in Sweden via that way. And this is what they don't realize. The migrant issue then becomes a major problem again. But again, that's European legislation that's imposing on Stockholm the view that they have to do this. And therefore, they carry out this measure, and undoubtedly they will have major problems. Sweden is bad enough as it is in terms of whatever's going on to do with migration problems. And they are huge, and the media never reports it. But it's absolutely shocking what's going on there. And they're just opening up the risk by saying, oh, well, it's like we're sorting our borders out, but we're not worried about the border with another country. Well, this is farcical because, does that equally apply to in the future where they'll start to limit the ID checks and get more lax about it? That is also the risk. So, and in the meantime, they cause more mayhem without realizing in quite simple terms that they've caused the problem again, but it's the European Union who are imposing these kind of restrictions on nations to actually be autonomous and make the decisions that are right. And that's what I find frustrating, is how European nations just repeatedly these things and don't think of the consequences. And perversely, the people in most of the countries are very benign and don't seem to care about it, don't think it's a problem.
And that's the whole entire thing, man. There is such a lackadaisical involvement within Europe, and it's dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. The reason why it's so dangerous is they feel that the politicians that they elect or somebody else would fix the problem. And it's kind of like what we've seen in World War II Germany, where everybody kind of just looked around, waited for somebody else to say something until it was too late, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this case, the too late. It's over. The European Union's is dead, buried, finished, however anyone wants to imagine otherwise. But the problem is the average person in the street doesn't really understand the extent of how serious a problem this is. And the chances are by the time they do it, it's absolutely going to be too late. And this is why, regarding France, that's why I said or in any nation, I wouldn't want to be, not that I'd ever want to be a prime minister or a president anyway, not that I'd ever even get the opportunity, but I certainly wouldn't want to be. And you absolutely wouldn't want to be at this point in time. And that's why, really, it doesn't mean Germany, who cares if Merkel or Scholz gets elected? It really doesn't matter because it's all over. But it's going to take a lot of time for this to come to fruition. It's rather like in Greece, how bad, there's a great example, how bad or how much worse does it have to get in Greece before the Greek people do something? It's incredulous. Some of the stories that I've heard over the years are just absolutely shocking. This may surprise. Here's, not that it's at all you would deem this acceptable anywhere in the world, but would you expect a Western European nation like Greece, where people over years have had to give up their children and put them up for adoption because they simply couldn't afford to feed or clothe them?
Right.
It's absolutely astonishing. it was, without being too graphic, but it is true. There was people literally starving to death because they couldn't feed themselves, because how the benefit system, I think, works in Greece is people just lost everything. After a certain period of time, you're rendered homeless. You've got nothing, and yet still the Greek people tolerate and put up with this. And undoubtedly, the rape and pillage of their nation will carry on until there literally is nothing left.
Mm-hmm.
And then what? But it just can't carry on indefinitely, and at some point the dam's going to break. But it's incredulous for me how long it's gone on in Greece with no one actually doing anything about it. I'm surprised the Greek people are tolerating. I mean, there were a lot of demonstrations in the initial stage, and they're all squashed. And maybe the Greek people just gave up and
They
thought
gave
it was
up.
pointless
The
trying.
descendants of the Spartans, which are the Greeks, and the descendants of the Vikings, which are the Swedes, have literally, I don't know what's become of them, Paul. They are gone. They're nowhere to be found.
No, absolutely. I mean, and then of course the whole Brexit thing just rumbles on, and people are trying to infer that it's hot air. It's not going to happen because the European Union thinks they can stomp all over the UK. Well, actually, it's proven the fact that they can't stomp, because they've actually had to admit this idea: we're gonna force this Brexit bill. It's going to be 60 billion euros. No, it's 80 billion. No, in fact, it's 100 billion euros. I mean, it goes up by the week. It's like hyperinflationary. And then they've had to actually admit now they have absolutely no legal recourse. It's impossible for them to demand any money from the UK. Well, of course they can't. It's all hot air, and people live in fear. And if you just call their bluff, I mean, for the UK's perspective, my fear is they will make a very bad job of this, because there's no one capable in the UK of making the right decisions. But for me, the best thing they could do is just tell the European Union, we're not playing you stupid games. We're not going to have these rows with you in public. Here's the bottom line: we either do this sensibly, we'll give you one opportunity. If you refuse to comply, we'll just walk away and leave. What are you going to do about it? You can
Nothing.
do nothing. There's nothing you can do. And then we will go and negotiate trade deals with nations, and we'll do what's right for the UK in that regard. And we'll be far better off outside the umbrella of the European Union. If they did that and actually had the backbone to do it, very quickly nations would go, hang on, well, actually, you can do that. And very quickly other nations would follow suit and realize we can get out of this. It's largely just fear and this belief that, the Troika, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, the IMF has got everyone over a barrel, and there's nothing we can do about it. We'll just call their bluff and go, leave, walk away from it. There's nothing they can do about it. And I think the UK kind of starts to realize that that's a possibility. And my biggest fear is they just don't have anybody, as I said, who's capable of going around the world and being mature and saying to the Russians, right, let's negotiate some trade deals, or to China, let's negotiate trade deals. Let's build some solid relations and cut all this bullshit that Russia's going to blow the world, and Russia's, hijacking every election, and Russia's everything that's bad in the world is related to Russia. Let's grow up and have a sensible, relationship. Russia and China would go, yeah, that's fine. We want to normalize relations. Let's do this. And very quickly, not only would the world realize, in fact, these aren't the enemy, and in fact, they're the people trying to rebuild the very two nations who are the cornerstone of rebuilding the multipolar world. It would benefit the UK hugely, and very rapidly, people would see these tangible changes that would demonstrate where the real problem lies. But of course, once again, it's back to this point: we don't have a government with real people elected. We have all these career politicians, people who have a vested interest to do as they're told, and won't step outside the comfort zone, because if they do, the consequences will be severe, as we've seen in history. So they don't. I mean, in the UK, they just generally tend to just get rid of people when they, remove them out of office, and they'll have some internal parliamentary squabble and remove people and get rid of them that way. They don't tend to do what happened to Kennedy, for example. But that is the reality, but nations just won't face it. And the European Union really just largely functions on hot air. And if anybody had the backbone to stand up and challenge them, they'd crumble and cave within a very, very short space of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, we're down to about the last 5 minutes of the show, man. Why don't you give your closing comments and then plug the website and the invaluable, absolutely precious subscriber service, which is a key intelligence briefing that people can get daily from you. And I think it's very critical that people have it. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, thanks very much for doing that. Well, my general summary is I think just pay as much attention to what is going on in the world with regards to everything that revolves around Russia and China. Yeah, pay attention to things in the West to some extent, but pay attention particularly as to what they are doing, where they're involved internationally, what they're doing domestically, and don't believe the nonsense that you read. I mean, the Chinese economy, and we haven't got time to talk about that now, but don't believe all the absolute rubbish. I mean, you hear this example of all this capital flight very briefly, and well, hang on. China's got trillions of dollars of forex currency. There is no capital flight. So you'll read a lot of nonsense. Don't believe that. Just look at the facts and see what they're doing. That will give us the biggest indication of what's happening in terms of global changes. But very briefly, I'll mention one point that I said to CJ before I came on, which I'm picking on the US Department of Defense this time, but they talked about they talked about the Syrian de-escalation zone plans and said, yeah, we know about them. But they said, but they're proposed in the areas where the Daesh group's not active, as though that was a problem. Now, according to me, a de-escalation zone should be where there isn't a war zone. And yet they think they should stick them right in the middle of a war zone. The whole point is it's to put them in an area where civilian life can return to normal and infrastructure can be built. But apparently, obviously, no wonder that the Department of Defense doesn't want them there. They want them smack in the middle of a war zone because they don't want these de-escalation zones to prosper, because then that will completely derail all their idea that, you know, there isn't a solution, a political solution to Syria. But it's absolutely gobsmacking and ridiculous that they come out with a statement that it's not in a war zone. Do they not understand what de-escalation means? It's just staggering. I mean, I kind of found it hilarious, but also quite tragically hilarious in the same breath. But anyway, I just thought I'd mention as a point. Well, it sort of amused me in one sense. But as for the website, we've got the SiriusReport.com. That's SIRIUS. We've got the YouTube channel where we're starting to do a little bit more work. That's London Paul. We've obviously got the Twitter page where we've been a little bit more active lately and had a few new followers. So thank you for that. And yes, the main thing we do is obviously the premium content, that's the tab on the website. It's 5 podcasts a week, 10 to 15 minutes for each one. And we cover off all the geopolitical stuff and the economic stuff. And we give you real bona fide information. When we talk about things, we analyze it, we break it down so people can understand what's going on. We'll give you bits of intelligence stuff that we can talk about, and such as, you know, when we anticipate things may happen in a broad sense. We don't give any dates, or we might give particular information regarding things to do with Russia and China that people aren't aware of, or also things going on in the West. So, and it's not stuff we talk about on the radio shows. Everything we talk about here, we don't put in the podcasts, and vice versa. So if people think they get all the information listening to this, then they don't. They get a small fraction of it on a week-to-week basis. We think $4.75 a month is good value, and we'd like people to subscribe and support our work, because we do put a lot of effort into produce quality reports each week. And many thanks, obviously, to everyone at Rogue Money for all their support and help. It's been a real pleasure doing all the radio shows and all the support they've offered. So we're very much in gratitude for all their help as well.
Absolutely. With that being said, folks, again, subscribe to Paul's channel as well on YouTube, and follow him at the Sirius Report on Twitter, as well as his premium service at thesiriusreport.com. And you can check us out on roguemoney.net. Follow us at the Rogue Money, and please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification button so that you guys are alerted when the new videos are going up. With that being said, CJ, we're all set. Take it away, buddy.